It was the spring of 1977 when Nora Caldwell, at the age of 25, became the sole proprietor of a legacy written in bluegrass and horsehide. Her father, John Caldwell, had passed with the last of the winter frost, leaving her the ranch that had been in their family for 3 generations. It was a sprawling, beautiful, and desperately demanding piece of Kentucky, a land of rolling hills that looked like a sleeping green giant under the vast sky. The inheritance felt less like a gift and more like a sacred, impossibly heavy weight. The ink was barely dry on the deed transfer when the first yellow machine clawed its way onto the adjacent property, a monstrous insect of steel and diesel tearing into the fence-lined tapestry of honeysuckle and wild rose. A man in a clean, white hard hat and mud-splashed boots strode across the property line as if he owned the very air she breathed. He found her by the main stable, mending a leather strap with her father's old tools, the smell of saddle soap and hay a comforting ghost in the air. He didn't introduce himself right away. He just took off his hat, wiped a line of sweat from his brow, and surveyed her land with an appraising eye. "Quite a view you've got here," he said, his voice a gravelly boom that seemed to startle the pigeons in the rafters. "Going to be even better for our guests." Nora set down the strap and stood up, wiping her hands on her jeans. She was not a large woman, but she stood with the grounded certainty of someone who knew every dip and rise of the soil beneath her feet. "I'm Nora Caldwell," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "This is my property." The man finally offered a name. He was the foreman for the construction project. "A luxury resort," he explained, "called the Bluegrass Scepter. Championship golf course, 5-star dining, a spa with waters imported from some far-flung European spring." He spoke of it as if he were announcing the second coming, a gilded salvation for the rustic countryside. He never once asked her opinion. He was informing her. He pointed to a set of blueprints tucked under his arm. "Your little ranch here," he said, gesturing expansively, "is going to be the perfect backdrop. Our high-end suites on the west wing will look right out over your pastures. People pay a fortune for this kind of authentic scenery." Authentic scenery. The words hung in the air between them, sharp and insulting. Her father's life's work, his father's before him, the very ground that held the sweat and soul of her family, reduced to a decorative element. A living postcard for wealthy people to gaze at from behind a pane of climate-controlled glass. She felt a hot flash of anger, a retort burning on her tongue, but she swallowed it. She had learned from her father that the loudest person in the room is often the weakest. Instead, she just nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "I see," she said. The foreman mistook her silence for acquiescence, for the dazed acceptance of a simple country girl overwhelmed by progress. He gave a patronizing smile. "Don't you worry, miss. We'll be good neighbors. You'll hardly know we're here, except for the noise and the dust for a year or 2. He chuckled, put his hat back on, and walked away, leaving Nora standing in the long shadow of the stable, the sound of distant engines already a promise of the invasion to come. She did not sell. The offers started trickling in a few weeks later, polite but firm letters from a law firm in Lexington representing the resort's parent corporation. They spoke of community development and mutual benefit. They offered her a sum that, on paper, was a fortune. It was enough to leave this place, to start a new life anywhere she wanted, free from the crushing responsibility of the mortgage, the veterinarian bills, the constant, back-breaking work. Some of the other local landowners had already taken the money, their fields soon to be manicured greens and sand traps. The community whispered. They said she was a fool, a sentimental girl clinging to a ghost. They said John Caldwell would have been smart enough to take the deal. But they didn't know John Caldwell. Not really. Let me tell you about her father. John Caldwell was a man who spoke to horses in a low murmur and could predict rain by the way the leaves on the silver maples turned their bellies to the sky. He was not a man of grand pronouncements, but of quiet, unshakable principles. He had taught Nora not in a classroom, but in the saddle, on long rides that stretched from dawn to dusk. "This land," he'd told her once, reining his stallion, a big-boned gray named Stonewall, to a halt on a high ridge. "It doesn't belong to us, Nora. We belong to it. For a little while. Our job is to listen to it, to learn its language, and to leave it a little better than we found it." His wisdom was not in ledgers or bank accounts. It was etched into the land itself. He had taught her the rhythm of the seasons, the feel of good soil, the difference between a tired horse and a sick one. He taught her self-reliance as a core virtue, not a fallback plan. "Debt," he used to say, "is a yoke you place on your own neck. Be beholden to no one but your own conscience and the good earth." The most precious thing he left her was not the land itself, but a key to understanding it. It was a large, leather-bound portfolio, cracked and worn from a lifetime of use. Inside, it didn't hold deeds or titles. It held maps he had drawn himself, by hand, over the course of 40 years. They were astonishingly detailed, showing not just the boundaries of their property, but the vast, untamed wilderness of the surrounding state-owned forests and forgotten hollows. On these maps, he had made notes in his neat, spidery script. Fox Den Ridge, best view of the sunrise, especially after a frost. Whispering Creek Trail, thick with wildflowers in May, careful of slick rocks. Old Man's Hollow, deer gather here at dusk in the autumn. It was a cartography of secrets, a lifetime of observation committed to paper, a tangible legacy of his deep, abiding love for this place. This portfolio was Nora's secret weapon, though she did not yet know it. The next year was a symphony of destruction. The roar of bulldozers, the shriek of saws, the percussive slam of hammers became the new soundtrack of her life. A fine layer of dust settled on everything, the porch railings, the water troughs, the leaves of the ancient oaks. The resort rose from the scarred earth like a monument to arrogance, a sprawling complex of sharp angles and reflective glass that rejected the landscape rather than embracing it. It looked alien, a gaudy jewel dropped carelessly in the mud. Nora ignored it. She turned her focus inward, to the rhythms of the ranch. She woke before the sun, her breath misting in the cool air, and worked until her muscles ached with a satisfying burn. She cared for her horses, her small but sturdy herd of quarter horses and Tennessee walkers, animals bred for calm temperament and sure-footedness. They were her partners, her confidants. In the quiet solitude of the barn, she felt her father's presence, his quiet approval. One evening, sitting on her porch and watching the last of the construction trucks rumble away, an idea began to form. It started as a flicker of defiance, a way to reclaim what the resort was trying to steal. They wanted authentic scenery. She would give them something more. She would give them an authentic experience. She went inside and retrieved her father's portfolio. Spreading the maps across the big oak dining table, she traced the familiar trails with her finger, the ones he had shown her as a girl. These were not just paths, they were stories, memories. There was a world out there, just beyond the manicured perfection of the resort, a world they knew nothing about. Let me stop and ask you something. Have you ever felt so deeply connected to a place that you knew its secrets, its moods, its hidden corners, like you knew the lines on your own hand? That was the knowledge Nora possessed. It was a knowledge the resort, with all its money and market research, could never purchase. The decisive act was a quiet one. It was not a lawsuit or a protest. It was an act of quiet confidence. She took a small portion of her dwindling savings and drove into town to see old Mr. Abernathy, the carpenter who had built fences for her father. She asked him to make her a sign. Nothing fancy, just a simple, handsome wooden sign with letters routed and painted black. A week later, he delivered it. It read, Caldwell Ranch, guided trail rides. Inquire at stable. With her own 2 hands, she dug the post holes and set the sign near the entrance to her long, gravel driveway, just far enough from the main road to be discreet, but just visible enough to a curious eye leaving the ostentatious, marble columned gates of the bluegrass scepter. She didn't advertise. She didn't print flyers. She just put up the sign. It was an invitation, not a solicitation. A quiet challenge to the curated boredom next door. The resort opened in the summer of 1978 with a gala event. There were fireworks that terrified her horses and music that pulsed late into the night. Nora watched the distant glitter from her porch and felt a strange sense of peace. The struggle was about to begin. For the first few months, her sign was mostly ignored. Her only customers were a few local families and a couple of the resort's off-duty kitchen staff who were homesick for the country. The whispers in the community continued. They saw her sign, her handful of horses, her quiet persistence, and they saw a tragedy. A girl playing at being a rancher, tilting at the windmill of progress. The resort's management, if they were aware of her at all, likely saw her as a quaint, harmless bit of local color. Then, one sweltering afternoon in late August, it happened. A man and his wife, dressed in expensive but impractical resort wear, wandered down her driveway. They looked bored and restless. The man, a software executive from California named Mr. Miller, explained that they had played golf, they had used the spa, they had eaten at all 3 restaurants. It was only day 2 of their week-long vacation. "There's nothing real to do here," he said, a note of profound disappointment in his voice. "Is that sign for real? Can we actually ride one of these horses?" Nora looked at them, at their pale faces, and their hunger for something genuine. "I have 2 horses saddled," she said simply. "What? We can leave in 10 minutes." She didn't take them on a simple loop around a pasture. She took them into her father's world. She led them down Whispering Creek Trail, where the air was cool and smelled of damp earth and mint. The horses' hooves made soft thuds on the packed dirt. She pointed out a hawk circling high overhead and the tracks of a raccoon by the water's edge. She didn't chatter. She let the silence of the woods do the talking. She led them to a small clearing her father had marked on his map as the Grotto, a place where a tiny waterfall trickled over moss-covered rocks into a clear pool. The air was thick with the scent of pine. The couple was silent, awestruck. They had been in Kentucky for 2 days, but this was the first time they had truly seen it. On the way back, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon and paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, the man, Mr. Miller, turned to her. "How much do we owe you?" he asked. She told him the modest price she had set. He handed her 3 times that amount. "That," he said, his voice filled with a reverence she had not expected, "was the best money I've spent all year. My God, the view from that ridge. It's what you see in paintings." That was the first sign. Mr. Miller returned to the resort a changed man. He didn't just talk about his experience. He evangelized. He told everyone at the pool, in the bar, at the concierge desk. He spoke of the quiet woman, the gentle horses, the hidden waterfall. He described the feeling of being on a horse, moving through a landscape that felt ancient and untouched, a stark contrast to the sterile perfection of the resort. He made it sound less like a tourist activity and more like a spiritual pilgrimage. The next day, 4 more guests showed up at Nora's gate. The day after that, 8. The trickle had started. This began the period of quiet, relentless toil. The subsequent few years were a masterclass in patience and hard work. Nora was up before dawn, feeding and grooming the horses, and often didn't finish cleaning tack until long after dark. She learned to manage a booking schedule, to gauge the skill level of her riders at a glance, to tell the story of the land without using too many words. She never expanded too quickly. She bought 2 more horses, then another 2, always choosing carefully. Every animal was a partner, not just livestock. She hired a local teenager, a quiet boy named Sam who had a good way with animals, to help her out. The ranch, which had been a place of solitary work, was now humming with a new kind of life. And the whispers from the community changed. Pity turned to curiosity, then to grudging respect. They saw the line of luxury cars parked along her driveway. They saw her buying the best hay, paying the vet on time, putting a new roof on the barn. She was not just surviving, she was thriving. All because she had understood something fundamental. The modern world, for all its comforts and conveniences, often leaves people starved for the genuine article. Her father's wisdom was proving more profitable than any stock portfolio. The resort guests were not just looking for a ride on a horse. They were looking for a connection to the land, to an animal, to a simpler, more authentic way of being. Nora wasn't selling a product. She was sharing a piece of her soul, and people were lining up to receive it. Of course, there were moments of doubt. There was one particularly brutal winter, the 2nd year in, when a blizzard dumped 2 feet of snow and the temperatures plummeted. The pipes in the barn froze. A sick foal required round-the-clock care. The bookings were canceled, the income dried up, and the bills kept coming. One night, huddled by the wood stove in her small kitchen, the glittering lights of the resort visible through the swirling snow, she felt a profound sense of exhaustion. The weight of it all pressed down on her. She pulled out her father's maps, her hands tracing the lines he had so carefully drawn. Was it worth it? This constant fight? For a moment she considered the alternative. The easy money, the freedom. The thought of calling the resort's lawyers in the morning was a powerful temptation. But then her eyes fell on a note her father had written in the margin of one map, next to a trail that led to a high, wind-swept peak. "The climb is hard," it read, "but the view is honest." A simple truth. She closed the portfolio, put another log on the fire, and decided to endure. The view was worth the climb. By the spring of 1981, the situation had become undeniable. The Caldwell Ranch was no longer an amenity. It was the main attraction. The resort's own internal surveys showed it. When asked, "What was the most memorable part of your stay?" the overwhelming majority of guests wrote some variation of the trail ride at the ranch next door. The concierge desk had a dedicated phone line just for fielding inquiries about Nora's rides. Travel magazines, writing articles about the Bluegrass Scepter, spent more paragraphs describing Nora's horses and the sunset views from her trails than they did the resort's spa or golf course. The resort had built a magnificent, multi-million-dollar frame, and Nora Caldwell owned the masterpiece that everyone wanted to see. The dynamic of power had shifted, slowly and irrevocably, like a river changing its course. The day of vindication came not with a trumpet blast, but with the crunch of gravel under the tires of a Lincoln Continental. Mr. Harrison, the general manager of the Bluegrass Scepter, the same sort of man as the foreman who had dismissed her as scenery 4 years prior, had made an appointment. He stepped out of his car, dressed in a suit that looked comically out of place next to a horse trough. He looked uncomfortable, humbled. He had the air of a man who was about to eat a large portion of crow. "Miss Caldwell," he began, forgoing any pleasantries, "we need to talk." They sat on her front porch, in the same wicker chairs her father and grandfather had used. He talked about synergy, about integration, about a formal partnership. He painted a picture of her ranch becoming an official resort activity, with uniformed staff and a slick booking system integrated into their own. He was still thinking in his own terms, still trying to absorb her world into his. When he was finished, Nora took a slow sip of her iced tea. She looked out at her pastures, at the horses grazing peacefully. She held all the cards, and she knew it. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice calm and steady, "I appreciate you coming all this way. I think a conversation is a good idea. I'll have my lawyer, Mr. Davies, contact your office to arrange a meeting to discuss the terms of a potential service contract." His face fell. A service contract, not a partnership. The language was precise, and the implication was clear. She would not be an employee. She would not be a partner. She would be a contractor, an independent entity setting its own terms. He was no longer dealing with a sentimental girl. He was dealing with a business owner, a formidable one. "Your lawyer?" he stammered, the last vestiges of his arrogance crumbling. "Yes," Nora said, a faint, unreadable smile on her lips. "My lawyer." The meeting took place a week later. Not at the resort's polished mahogany boardroom, but at Nora's ranch house, at the old oak dining table where she had studied her father's maps. Mr. Harrison and his two corporate lawyers from Lexington sat on one side. On the other sat Nora and Mr. Davies, a shrewd, silver-haired country lawyer who had known Nora since she was a child and had handled her father's will. Mr. Davies didn't say much, but his presence filled the room. The resort's lawyers came in with a thick proposal, a partnership agreement that was, in reality, a corporate takeover disguised in friendly language. Mr. Davies read it silently for a few minutes, then pushed it back across the table. "This is not an acceptable starting point," he said, his voice mild. "In fact, it is not a starting point at all. Let me explain the reality of the situation." And he did. For the next hour, he and Nora laid out their terms. They were not negotiating, they were dictating. The Caldwell Ranch would remain an independent business, wholly owned and operated by Nora Caldwell. The resort would be granted the privilege of offering the Caldwell Ranch experience to its guests. All bookings would be handled exclusively by Nora's staff, at prices set by Nora. The resort would pay a substantial annual retainer, a 7-figure sum, simply for the right to market this access. Furthermore, the resort's marketing materials would have to be approved by Nora and would be required to feature the ranch not as an amenity, but as a premier, named experience. She would have absolute control over the trails, the number of riders, and the schedule to ensure the health of her horses and the preservation of the land. She was protecting her father's legacy, not just monetizing it. Mr. Harrison sat there, his face pale. His lawyers whispered furiously to him. They looked at their proposal, then at Nora's calm, determined face, and they knew they had lost. They had no leverage. Their entire business model had become dependent on the one thing they had treated with utter contempt. After a long, tense silence, Mr. Harrison finally looked across the table, not at the lawyer, but directly at Nora. His voice was quiet, stripped of all its former bluster. "We agree," he said. "To all of it." As they were packing their briefcases, defeated, he paused at the door. "Miss Caldwell," he said, "just one question. How did you know? How did you know this would happen?" Nora looked up from her father's table. "You came here and saw scenery, Mr. Harrison," she said. "My father taught me to see the land. You were selling a view. I was offering a feeling. People will always pay more for the feeling. Let's jump forward 20 years, to the late 1990s. Nora Caldwell is in her mid-40s. She stands on that same high ridge her father loved, the one with the honest view. The ranch is more prosperous than ever, a model of sustainable, ethical business. The old stables have been meticulously restored. The fences are strong, and the pastures are a deep, rich green. The horses are healthy and happy. The bluegrass scepter is still there, a permanent fixture on the horizon, its success inextricably linked to hers. It has become a place people go specifically to have the experience that Nora provides. She never married the resort. She simply made it a very profitable tenant of her world. But the real legacy is not the money or the fame. It's the small hand that is now holding hers. Her son, a boy of 10 with his grandfather's eyes, stands beside her. He's on his own pony, a gentle mare. Nora unhooks a worn leather portfolio from her saddle. It's the same one her father carried. She opens it and points to the map, her finger tracing a faint line. "See this trail, Daniel?" she says, her voice soft. "This is Whispering Creek. Your Grandpa John used to say that if you're quiet enough, you can hear it tell stories about all the seasons it's seen." The boy listens, his eyes wide with a mixture of wonder and concentration. He is learning the language of the land, just as she did. The wisdom is being passed on. The cycle continues. They came in 1977 with their money and their machines, with blueprints that promised manufactured happiness. They looked at a young woman, a field of grass, and a few old buildings, and they saw something quaint to be bulldozed or, at best, ignored. They saw a backdrop. They never bothered to ask what it was the backdrop to. They thought the value was in the window looking out, not in the world on the other side. Nora Caldwell knew better. She knew that true value isn't built with steel and glass. It's nurtured over generations with patience, respect, and a deep, abiding love. They wanted to sell a luxury experience, but she held the deed to the one thing they could never create, something real. And in the end, the real thing always wins.